So with the book of Numbers coming to a close, we are nearing the end of the Exodus narrative. In a couple Shabbats from now, we'll open the book of Deuteronomy. But the book of Deuteronomy is just Moses retelling the story we already have told that started since verse 1 of the book of Exodus. I suspect that after this week's Torah portion, where God tells Moses to prepare for his own dying, because he's not going to enter into the promised land, Moses has the great idea to tell God, well, let me just give one more speech before I go, and here's the entire book of Deuteronomy. Talk about milking it. It's like, just let me retell you the whole story, how it all happened once upon a time, right? But that's what happens this week. We are, after 40 years of wandering, finally at the edge of the promised land. 30 years ago, the nation that had just come out of Egypt, nation of Hebrew slaves, turned their backs on the promised land. They were not in a space in consciousness that would allow them to settle the land of Canaan. You can take the Hebrews out of Egypt, but you couldn't take Egypt out of the Hebrews. They still had this slave mentality. And so God decided that he was going to take another 38 years for that generation that was enslaved in Egypt to perish through the travels, and for a new generation that was born free to come to the edge of the promised land once again and step fully into that land. Which is possibly why God tells Moses, you're not moving in. You're not going to follow them. Prepare for your own death. But everything is ready, Joshua will take over and lead the conquest of Canaan. Everything has been planned. The Torah has been given. The laws have been now implemented for the last 38, 40 years. We got into this rhythm of following the laws of God. Even the land of Canaan had already been divided. We haven't even stepped a foot in the land yet, but we had already divided the land according to the tribes, and within the tribes according to the clans, and within the clans according to each family. Before ever walking in, we knew where everyone was going to settle and pitch their tents. And it feels like this is, the wrapping of the whole story. We're nearing the end. It's going to be nice. We're going to tie a bow, and it's going to be just easy. We're going to walk into Canaan like nothing happened. And then, because there's always a then, in the middle of this week's Torah portion, once again, complaint arises from within the tribes. Another complaints come to Moses, the elders, Eleazar, the priests. Poor Moses. To his dying day, that he'll still be complaining. Am kashe oref, stiff-necked people. This time the complaint is severe. They've always been severe, but this time it's really severe. This time the complaint is about to undermine the very foundation of the law that God gave mouth to ears to Moses. This time the complaint is about to call into question this patriarchy, this long-held tribal male-dominated patriarchy that was the culture of the time, that was the society that had emerged 3,000 years ago. This time, it was for real. And I read, the daughters of Zelophehad came forward. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the chieftains, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And they said, our father died in the wilderness, and he has left no son. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he had no son. Give us a piece of land among our father's kinsmen. What do you think happens next? What do you think those good old boys sitting around Moses smoking cigars are going to say to these young women who are challenging the laws of Moses, the laws of God? The laws of inheritance as dictated by God, just at Sinai 38 years ago, were very clear. The laws of inheritance is such that only sons can inherit from their fathers. Period. No exceptions. Well, now we're going to give women the right to own property. This flies in the face of this patriarchy, this system of living that we've had for generations. You can imagine those bearded, powerful men. We're not going to react to that challenge. We know what they're going to say. The 5 daughters of Zelophehad are going to be scorned, sent back to their tents, never to show their faces again. Put them back in their places. That's the way we do it in the patriarchy. Well, we would be completely wrong. We would be absolutely, completely wrong. Let me tell you what happened. The Torah says, and Moses brought their case before the Eternal. Now there's so much that is not said in that very pithy verse that responds to the plea from the daughters of Zelophehad. It simply says, Moses brought their case before the Eternal. But you can imagine what happened. Those guys around Moses, and Moses included, with their cigars, suddenly were like, oh my God, what is going on? Like somehow they were able to hear the 5 daughters. I have their names. Machla, Noah, Chagla, Milcah, and Tirza. They heard them. They didn't scold them. They didn't rebuke them. We would have known immediately. They heard their voices. They heard their complaint. They took it in. Even though they were challenging the very foundation of the society they had built, even though they were challenging the laws of God, they opened their hearts. Somehow they opened their hearts. They didn't let the ego respond immediately. They didn't let the voice of fear that could have reacted from the threat these 5 women were posing to their way of life. No, they didn't. They stood still. They took it in. They heard. They listened. They remained open. And then they stepped into this gorgeous place of not knowing. They dropped into this place of not knowing who was right and who was wrong, not knowing what to do next, not knowing. There was this blank space, this gorgeous spaciousness that opened up for them. And they stood there, they sat there, they took a few breaths there. They knew that whatever the answer was, they didn't have it. They knew that this was beyond their pay grade. They also understood that whatever answer was to flow through them was to come from a higher level of consciousness. They knew that no issue, no problem, no challenge can find its answer if it's answered from the same level of consciousness from which the challenge is arising. No problem in our lives today can be solved from the level of consciousness from which that issue, that problem is arising. We have to find a higher plane, a higher level from which we can gain greater perspective. That's the place from which answers flow. So what did they do? They looked around and they said, we're going to send Moses. Ask God. And Moses went and talked to God. And the Eternal One said to Moses, listen to that. That's amazing. And the Eternal One said to Moses, the plea of Zelophehad's daughters is just. You should give them a holding among their father's kinsmen. Transfer their father's share to them. Further, speak to the Israelites people as follows. If a householder dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. God rescinded God's own law. God amended the Torah. God realized that God had made a mistake and changed the law. That, of course, also changed all of Jewish law. This case in Torah is quoted in the Talmud and is the source for the laws of hereditary giving to this day. There are two things. I mean, there's so many layers in that little, very short, small story. There's so many layers of understanding. But there are two really that have resonated with me this week, this Shabbat. The first one is that we should emulate Zelophehad's daughters. That if we are faced today with laws that are unjust, then we, like them, need to stand in front of anyone in power and call the injustice for what it is, and act so that the laws that are unjust can be changed. And it's so true right now because laws that discriminate or attack children like Zelophehad's daughters, orphans like Zelophehad's daughters, families who've lost members, killed in violent outcomes, just like Zelophehad's daughters. Their story is our story. Their story 3,000 years ago is the story we see unfolding today. And we are Zelophehad's daughter. It is our duty, just like them, to stand in front of the law and say, this must change. This isn't right. And you know how we do it? We literally stand up. We literally stand up and walk in the streets. We demonstrate. We show up at rallies. And he makes a difference. If you think that he doesn't, here let me tell you what happened 80 years ago. And I'm not making any correlation with what is going on today in our country and what happened 80 years-ish ago in Nazi Germany. Far from me to say anything like that, because it just diminishes the suffering of those who went through this horrible, devastating, murderous war So I'm not. What I'm saying is that if the German people, and this is actually demonstrated historically, many historians have written papers and books about this. If the German people had stood up and demonstrated in the streets of Berlin, Munich, or anywhere else in Germany, as the laws of segregation, the laws that Hitler started to impose on the country, he would have backed down. We know that because every time that happened, he did. Hitler was afraid of his own people. And what he did was, he had a decree. He promoted eugenics, and then he waited and see if there were going to be any reactions. And then he went after gay people, LGBTQ, and then he went after the Roma people, and then he went after the Jews, and he waited each step of the way to see if anybody would say anything. And every time nobody did, he pushed it a little further, and a little further, and a little further, until we got to 1942 and the final solution, and then it was too late. There are cases, which is why we know that story could have unfolded another way. One story was that at some point Hitler decided that he was going to deport, to send to the concentration camps, the Jewish spouses of interfaith married Germans. And so he grabbed them, especially in Berlin, and put them all in one building. And the non-Jewish spouses alerted their families, their friends. They went on hunger strikes. They demonstrated in the streets. And their husbands, their wives, Jewish husbands and wives, were immediately freed. I mean, immediately. It took a few days. But Hitler got scared. Hitler was scared. We cannot underestimate the power of every one of us, like the Zelophehad daughters, to stand, literally stand, and walk in the streets and be at the rallies and show up. We are Zelophehad's daughters. Now, the second aspect of this story, and again, there are so many, we could pull threads until midnight, touches me on a little more personal level. And I'm gonna involve you in a little exercise, if you don't mind. I'd like you to just close your eyes for a moment and see if you can recall a moment in recent days, maybe in recent weeks, that you got into it with someone else. And I'm sure it doesn't happen to you. It happens to me. And maybe sometimes it's with a loved one. Maybe sometimes it's with a colleague, somebody that you're close to, you work closely to, and you really lost it. And both of you really went into a shouting match. Both of you went unconscious and very reactive. So can you bring that up? Can you bring yourself back into that place? And if that's never happened to you, just make it up. I mean, feel into what happened. And I'm going to venture to say, because it's true for me, that what happened in that moment is that the laws of your life felt threatened, that your way of life felt threatened, that your shoulds and your oughts got attacked. Right, your laws, your own laws, like the laws of God, right? Your own laws suddenly were put into question. Your expectations were undermined. Just like in our story. And so what you did is what we would expect, like the elders, to do to the Zelophehad daughters, is to react. To react with anger, because it's a reaction of fear. But what if we could imagine a different way? So what if the story, just stay with it still, stay with your eyes closed. What if in your story, imagine yourself not falling into the trap of reaction, but doing like the elders did, and just being with what is, receiving the moment as it presents itself, and breathing into that. Being present to the buttons that are being pushed within you, and breathing around that as well. Now, perhaps seeing for a moment what fears, what anxieties, what buttons were pushed on the other side that triggered that reaction in them. The fear. What was the fear? What could have been the fear within them? As you notice your own fear, what is the fear within you? And now go a step further. As you hold whatever the energies are, step into the not knowing. Step into the not knowing of whatever comes next. The not knowing who's right or who's wrong. The not knowing if your position is going to ever be the position, the answer. Can you be in that place of not knowing what is true and what is false? And when you really step into that place in the heart space, the heart of not knowing, suddenly there is the love opening as a possibility. Suddenly there is compassion. Suddenly there is embrace. Not knowing allows us not to make up our minds. Because we don't know if the mind we are making up is the right mind to make up. Who knows? And I'm not saying they were right and I was wrong. It doesn't matter. Not knowing simply means not knowing. I don't know. Now, from that space of telling myself, I don't know, can I seek to touch this higher self within me? We can't solve any problem at the level of consciousness from which it is arising. Can I step a little higher, maybe a little deeper? It doesn't matter. Can I step in a place that has a broader perspective, that can see more, that can take the whole picture in now? Can I climb up the mountaintop of my own consciousness and see in the valley below the whole problem? My buttons, their buttons, my fears, their fears, my stuckness, their stuckness. And breathe into that space and let the universe tell us what is appropriate to respond from. Now, I'm asking you, what does that look like in that moment for you, in that example that you brought up? What are you saying? What are you doing? So consider for a moment that this short story in the Torah is a blueprint for a spiritual practice, a 3-step spiritual practice. Acknowledge, be with what is, know what's happening within you, know the fear, know the anxiety, know the anger. Step into the not knowing. I don't have the answers. My way might not be the way. I might not be right. I do not know. I may be, but I do not know. Can I move step 3 into a deeper space within myself? into the heart, to listen there for the answers. Can I not be attached to whatever the still small voice will whisper in my ear? And that might also mean, from that place, that you walk out the door of your house and you go demonstrate and you go march. But now you're doing it from a different place. Now you're doing it from a place of love and compassion and understanding, instead of a place of anger and rejection and fear.